Hi, everyone. Can you hear me? Can you hear me? Can you hear me? Yeah. Hi. Hello. Hi. Welcome to the best panel in all of Perugia. Because, as we all know, audio is the greatest thing that ever happened to all of us, and that is said with a lot of hesitance. So please forgive my very clickbaity title for this panel. Of course, audio is not the solution for all hard access stories, but for a lot of them, and that's what we'll get into today. So welcome today. I'm so glad so many of you showed up. I am Jasmin Bauomy. I'm a podcast producer in Germany at TRZ Media. It's a small startup that is dropping big things, if you look into it. I have the best panelists with me. I have Phil Maguire. Phil is our Chief Executive of Prison Radio, the Prison Radio Association in the UK, and can tell us about one of the hardest places to access for audio, which is prison. We have one of my old friends, Josephine Karianjahi, our co-founder from Africa Podfest, who brings to the table a vast network of African podcast creators and journalists. If you ever want to know anything about what's going on the continent, she is your person to go to. Ramsey Tesdell, also at this point, one of the my oldest friends, or older friends, not oldest. He's the co-founder and CEO of Sout, one of the leading, if not the leading podcast studio in the Middle East right now. All right, shall we get into this? I'm going to start with Phil and maybe with just generally the topic. I already got into it a little bit. Let me put up my notes. Also, please forgive, I am very nervous. I did not expect this many people to show up. All right, so there's a bunch of reasons and buzzwords when we talk about audio, because right now, and for the last, 5-10 years, podcasting has been super, super sexy. People say it's cheap, which, by the way, it's not. But of course, buzzwords like it's so intimate, it's so anonymous, you can get to all the stories, there's a low threshold to enter the podcast world. All of that is also true. I'm not saying none of this is true, which is why we're here. You can get access to some amazing stories you otherwise wouldn't get access to. But does that mean that everything should be a podcast? I don't know. Is audio really the one size fits all? Let's get into this today. So we'll walk you today through some of the examples that these amazing folks on the panels, on this panel, and myself have figured out, and we'll be listening to some stuff as well. So, Phil, can you tell people what you do and what you don't do, maybe, and why do we make audio in prisons?
That's a great question. Thank you very much, Jasmin, and thank you all for being here. It's a real privilege to be here today. I run the Prison Radio Association, which is an NGO in the UK, and we run National Prison Radio, which is the world's first national radio station for people in prison. And we work with and for people in prison to create the programs. And I'm also working to drive the development of Prison Radio International, a global network of people working with audio in criminal justice settings. Why do we do it? We do it because audio is a great medium to use in prisons. It's very difficult to get cameras into prisons. It's much easier, not simple, but much easier to get microphones into prisons. And because it's intimate and anonymous, and it's a great medium to use. The reason we exist is to humanize people in prison, to give people who live in prison a voice, to give them a platform from which to tell their stories and ask difficult questions. And we work to support people through their prison sentences to help them prepare for life outside prison and to survive within prison. And we practice good journalism. We work in partnership with government. We have to because we're in their buildings. But we work hard to maintain our independence, our journalistic integrity, and a big part of what we do is holding power to account, asking difficult questions to the people in charge.
Thanks. And you brought a clip for us so that we kind of get an idea as to what it is that you do. Do you want to intro that clip a little bit?
Yeah, National Prison Radio is only available to people that live in prisons, so it's difficult to get a feel for what it sounds like. We do a whole range of things with National Prison Radio. We ask tough questions, we do discussions, documentaries, interviews, but we also, for a lot of people inside prison, we're the only source to music and to entertainment. So I asked one of the guys inside HMP Brixton, where we're based, the oldest prison in London, to take 24 hours of National Prison Radio and to condense it into 2 minutes. So this is 24 hours of NPR in 2 minutes.
All right, let's have a listen.
24 hours of NPR in 2 minutes.
Porridge. Monday to Friday mornings from 7.
Good morning, you're listening to Porridge with myself, Ben, and of course I'm in the studio with Alex.
Prison news.
The government intends to ban smoking in all prisons in England and Wales. The move follows a series of legal challenges by prison officers and inmates.
Hello, welcome to the Hot 20. I'm Scott Mills from BBC Radio 1, and I'm on National Prison Radio for 1 week only, and it's an honour and a joy to be here. Thanks for having me, Johnny.
Welcome to National Prison Radio, Scott.
NPS, spice, rice, mamba, synthetic drugs.
Reasons to quit.
I was in the pad and there was a few lads smoking spice, and this lad started jerking and he fell to the floor, foaming at his mouth, and he died.
I don't think the guy even realised how close he was to going over.
That's going to stick with you for life. Like, if someone dies in front of you, like, you're in the cell with a dead body, you'll never forget that.
You never forget when you see someone die.
Work it, taking the next step.
In association with the National Careers Service.
And then eventually, within 2 years, I have my own pig farm. I mean, I've got my own butcher's shop now. I've got 15 vans on the road. I've got 26 staff. I've got 800 pigs. But it's just really living proof that if I can do it, anyone can do it.
Books unlocked. Every night at 11.
I inched my way along the oar till my feet were against the bow of the boat. Richard Parker was beneath the tarpaulin, his back to me, facing the zebra.
Music and advice to help you chill out through the night. National Prison Radio, Dream Time. Every night from midnight.
24 hours of NPR in 2 minutes.
Holy moly. That was intense. Nice. So there's something that I just noticed while listening to it. There's a lot of really tough accents. So making me think, this isn't necessarily made for me, is it?
No, it's made for people that live in prison in the UK. Yeah.
So that's already really interesting, because I'm sure some of you all are sitting here going like, how can I get a story from prison? Which this isn't. So Phil might have more to say about this. Do you have more to say?
About journalists trying to access stories from prison? It's tough. The best example I can give is in the UK. So as well as running National Prison Radio and making podcasts and developing Prison Radio International, we also make programs as an independent production company, mainly for the BBC. And if I want to make a program from inside prisons for the BBC, I have to go through the same process as any other journalist. I have to approach the Ministry of Justice press office and I have to request permission. And they are infamous for saying no to more than 99% of things that are asked. So it's very, very difficult for journalists to get into prisons to cover stories in prisons. And almost every week, I'm approached by a journalist who will say to me, we really like what you do, we'd like to do something in partnership with you, which is code for, can you help me get my journalists into prison, please? And we almost always say no.
Thanks for that. So you once told me that prison radio is a good idea, but not all prison radio is good.
Yeah, it's true. So prison radio is growing around the world. It's sprouting up everywhere. There are some projects that have been around for 20 plus years, and every week or every month I'm approached by people that have heard about prison radio and come and say, can you advise us on how to make this happen? I think there are two main pitfalls with prison radio, and one is where it lacks legitimacy because of the nature of prisons, because they're run by authorities, there needs to be a partnership with government. And if the government decides to take too much control over the project and there's no editorial independence, the project lacks legitimacy, the audience doesn't believe it, nobody listens, and it just becomes a mouthpiece for the authorities. So that's one example. And I guess another example is where people use prison radio just as a tool for resistance. So there it lacks sustainability because you have to find a way of working in partnership with the authorities in order to get into the buildings and in order to stay in the buildings and hopefully to secure some funding to do what you do. And so a really important part of my work over the last 17, 18 years since I've been in this job has been managing my relationship with government and treading that very fine diplomatic line around how they can trust us to get on with it, how we're allowed to be independent, how we get away with asking them very difficult questions. And most of the people around the world that come to us for advice and support, that's their main question. How can we, A, convince the authorities this is a good idea, and B, work in a sustainable, impactful and legitimate way whilst working in partnership with government?
Ramsey has a question.
Can I ask you a question? So the relationship between the journalists and the prisoners, or in the prison, they're not journalists, right? They're the people that are incarcerated actually making the programs, but also the relationship between you and the authorities is very important. How do you think about that in places where you don't have a good official partner, you know, in some of the regions that we work in and whatnot? How would you think about building that relationship?
Okay, it's a good question. So the first bit, the relationship with people in prison, what we do is very successful in terms of our audience in prison. So 86% of people in prison in the UK listen to National Prison Radio for more than 11 hours every week. So we've got great figures, we've got a great relationship with our audience. And we have that great relationship with our audience because of our unique production methodology. We have a team of professional radio producers. I have a team of 24 people, lots of them formerly working for the BBC. They ensure that the quality of what we're delivering and what we're producing is very high, but they all work side by side, hand in hand with people that live in prisons. So they co-produce and they present all of our programming, or nearly all of our programming. So that's what makes it credible and relevant to the audience. We're speaking in the right way, asking the right questions, using the right voice. In terms of, so the second bit of the question was, in jurisdictions where it's difficult to engage with government, how do we make the case?
Yeah, you don't have a trusted partner, for example.
Yeah. So you don't have a trusted partner as in the NGO, for example, or the
government?
The government. Fair enough. It's tricky. It's really tricky. There have been examples of great radio projects that have been born and have developed and have done incredible work, but then the government has decided that they want to use it as a tool of authority. And one example that I'm sure they won't mind me giving out is in Hungary. There was a great project running in prisons in Hungary, and then the government of Hungary kicked out most of the NGOs working inside prisons, including the organisation that were running the radio project there. So I believe that prison radio still exists in Hungarian prisons, but it's now a tool of the authorities. It's difficult. It's not going to work everywhere. There are some governments that you can't convince. But what we're trying to do with Prison Radio International is build a global case for why this is a good idea. What I had to do in the UK was learn the language of government, look at what the Ministry of Justice in the UK said it wanted to do, and then I had to find a way of framing what we do to fit in with their objectives. So the example is they used to talk about the 7 pathways to reducing reoffending. They talked about the importance of family relationships, physical and mental health, drug rehabilitation, etc., etc. So at the very beginning, we framed all of our content around those 7 pathways. So we learned to speak the language of government. And collectively around the world, we're building up the evidence base that this is a worthwhile endeavour and that this can be an effective way of working. So occasionally, and the fact that we've done it so effectively in the UK, we don't know everything, we don't know how it works. It works, the way we do it works for us, and it's constantly evolving, and I'm constantly learning from people around the world. We do it in one particular way. That's not the way to do it, that's not how it works everywhere. But by collectively building a global network, we think that gives us power to convince governments in other jurisdictions that this is worthwhile.
Thanks. And since you already mentioned it in terms of global network, can you tell us more about what's been going on globally in terms of prison radio? And I think you've got, since we also have Josephine here, some examples from the African continent, right?
Yeah. So more than a decade ago, for the first time, I was approached by somebody asking for support to develop a project. They were from Trinidad and Tobago. I went to Trinidad and Tobago. Tough job, but somebody has to do it. I went out there initially to convince the government that prison radio was a worthwhile initiative, and I had lots of meetings with the Secretary of State for Justice, the head of the prison service, people running prisons, people living in prisons. And at the end of that visit, we convinced the Secretary of State for Justice to develop National Prison Radio, and he wrote a cheque. We had a public meeting with the nation's media there, and he wrote a cheque and declared that prison radio was going to happen. 11 months later, so for 11 months, we sort of offered some support and advice about programming, about technology, about education, about how it could work. And then 11 months later, we went back and we helped cut the ribbon on the radio station in the maximum security prison in that country. Then for many years, lots of other people have started talking to us and to each other about prison radio developing. And we talked about developing this international network. And then COVID changed everything, and I could talk all day about how it's changed the work that we do. But when everybody got very familiar with video calling, we realized that this was a great opportunity to bring everybody together around the world. So in November 2021, we ran our first Prison Radio International Conference on Zoom. We did the same thing the following year, and then in summer, in June, we met for the first time in person in Oslo for the first in-person Prison Radio International Conference. So we are working to build a network, we're working to build evidence bases, we're looking at content sharing. We have been running a project in Latin America where we're trialing a sort of a regional approach to prison radio development. So I visited Uruguay and Argentina. Again, visiting lots of people in prisons and running prisons and at universities to build a network. We did a data collection exercise through which we discovered there were at least 35 prison radio initiatives happening in Latin America. 18 of those were in Argentina. And we are about to go into the second phase of that project. And if that proves effective and we're able to build networks in Latin America that then can be mutually supportive, we're going to hopefully the year after next look at our next regional area. And I'm currently talking to somebody in Nairobi who's looking to develop prison radio, and he's made great inroads convincing the authorities there that this is worthwhile. So this is why I'm really delighted to meet Josephine and to learn more about the historical context of criminal justice in Kenya.
Nice, thanks. Josephine, did you have any experience with prison radio in Kenya? Have you heard about any projects there?
Well, since we've been prepping for this panel, definitely much more. But one of the things that I found quite compelling about connecting with new and government partnerships is that, as you said, it does take quite a bit of time. And for audio projects where we've podcasts as well as radio to podcast and podcast to radio, there are some unique circumstances in each country across Africa. I can't speak for every country, but what I've observed in Kenya is that there is an opportunity there, and I hope that your colleague is very successful.
Thanks. So we've now heard about hard access, a particular hard access story with a very strong focus, which is prisons, which are hard to access. But my question to you would be what would be hard access stories in the regions that you are most familiar with on the African continent, amongst the countries there?
So, as Africa Podfest, one of the things that we've encountered on an almost weekly, almost daily basis is this idea that Africa is a country. And it's been written about by your favorites, by people you haven't met yet. But one of the things that audio has done, that we've observed across the podcast world, is it's created an opportunity for people who are working specifically in audio journalism to have longer form stories, to have opportunities to tell stories where the subject of the stories cannot be on video at all because of safety. It's an opportunity for everyone who's creating audio in those contexts to talk in their own languages. And when I talk about individual languages, most of the podcasts that many of us have listened to are in English or in French. Perhaps there are many who have experienced podcasts in African languages spoken in Africa, which are worldwide languages, but that's not typical. And so audio journalists who can communicate in these languages to their audience in Africa and in the African diaspora definitely have created an opportunity for people who can gather these stories and give a 360 view of what's happening in each African country, in each contextual situation. That's where the opportunity is for hard access stories. And so some of you have experienced some of the global companies that have worked on podcasts about Africa. And we experienced what is really remarkable in that large-scale advertising won't reach typical podcasts. So most of the funding for many of the hard access stories is through grants, is through philanthropy. It is through media and people who are commercially in the media business. And so you'll find that, yes, there are podcasts where the main host is sitting in Paris or London or Amsterdam or New York, but the people who are gathering the stories are audio journalists in the Gambia, in Zimbabwe, in Uganda, and in even more remote contexts than we can ever imagine, and sending and collecting their audio using what many of you might not necessarily use. You might not use different social media apps to collect and send safely. You might not necessarily have to translate using unique translators who are only located at specific points along the road. You know, the incredible journey that those journalists take to gather those stories and bring them to a larger context is what we at Africa Podfest have found remarkable.
And I'd love to introduce you all to this other podcast, which is called I Will Not Grow Old Here. This is a South African production. And it's, if you ask me, a perfect example of why audio is a great tool for hard access stories. This is a podcast about a young woman growing up in Alexandra, a township. I had the producer, whose name I will definitely butcher, but she will introduce herself, send us a little video about what the challenges were in making this. But I want to play you a little clip of this. Oh, great. Wait, hold on. Let's play this.
Hold on. Okay. So today is the 5th of May, 2022. It's actually my little sister's birthday. And I want you to come with me. So there's this little gem I want to show you. It literally has one of the best views. It's a bit of a walk, but it's totally worth it. I'm fine, thanks. Geez, I'm just very warm for the outside weather. I didn't realize how cold our house is until now that I'm outside and I'm kind of burning in this hoodie that I'm wearing. Hi. Hello. This is it, my friend.
This is it. Taking my cue from this. This is a lovely four-part podcast where she Marianne is her name, takes us through her life and how hard it is to kind of like become an adult, and the friendships and everything. And there's a lot of reasons why this was great. So let's hear from the producer. Did you want to give some more context, Josephine?
Well, so one of the things that I remember encountering this podcast is you said, you have to listen to this podcast. It's amazing. It's great. And it came out middle of last year. And it's the only African podcast that was nominated for an Ambies ever. And for those of you who are familiar with the Ambies, it's what to the audio world, the Grammys, and that kind of level of recognition has not happened before. The other really remarkable thing about this podcast is that it's the first time this particular production house has done this kind of a production. And the whole team is very experienced on the media side in various aspects, but really on this style of story-driven podcasting, this was their first big production. Mm-hmm. And so listening also to Marianne, who's 23, she works 5 jobs. She is a journalist. She's thinking of moving out of Alex. She's trying to figure out what the rest of her life will look like. Definitely her own statement, I will not grow old here, means I don't want to be another older person retiring here, like some of the folks I encounter. But one of the things that really struck me was, if you're talking about youth unemployment in Africa, and you're talking about the fact that most of the population is under 25, this makes a really big and impactful topic very, very, very close to us. It brings it into your ear in a way that a lot of what we've captured on video, or many people will come in and be able to capture in 1 or 2 days, they captured in a number of months, and they were able to do and interact with people in Alex because Marianne is living in Alex in that way.
Yeah, and just some context also for this video, I edited it. This is an edited clip. She answered another question about her equipment, which I was so curious about, because if anybody's ever been in that area, walking around a township with big equipment is quite the challenge. So you want to be as inconspicuous as possible, which is again why this is a hard access story in terms of you can't be walking around with a big crew. So she had a small mic, a small lapel mic that she had on while walking around, where we just heard these clips from, so that she could do all of this. And then she had a proper hand mic for when she was at home with somebody, which is really cool. So let's hear from the producer.
Hi, my name is Lesedi Mokhwat.
Oh.
And I'm the editor and host for Radio Workshop. Thanks so much for this opportunity to talk about our great project, I Will Not Grow Old Here. It really was a massive milestone for us as a production team. And yeah, we definitely faced challenges. We had never really taken on a project of this scale, so it was a massive learning experience for us, but so much fun. I would say the first challenge is that we set out to produce one episode and ended up with 3. So that meant that we had to adjust and rethink things in terms of our capacity, with money, with time, with going from a project that would maybe take 1 month to 2 months to, being in production for 6 months. So we learned a lot about what we need to consider for a following project, around what we compress and how much work and effort we put into pre-production. It was the first time we did something of this nature, so yeah, I mean, it was expected, but yeah, it was a big learning curve and a challenge that we had to overcome. Then secondly, I think maybe the safety thing. Marianne, as she speaks about in the podcast, lives in a community where she doesn't always feel safe, and it didn't feel good sending her out into the streets with this equipment as a young woman on her own. So we had to really think about what we could use equipment-wise to make her feel safe, or have situations where she's going to collect tape not on her own, and when she is on her own, just giving her a kit that's discreet and won't cause or attract too much attention. And then maybe the third challenge, which was also a fun challenge, was many of us from the team come from sort of news or radio or reporting background, which has a very specific tone. And, with podcasting, we're really looking for that personal, intimate narration, that authentic voice to tell the story. So that needed a little bit of readjustment in studio when we were recording all the narrations. We really had to work on that part so that Marianne sounds like herself. But yeah, we managed. I think it turned out okay. And then in terms of the medium of audio having the most impact, I think the story could have been told maybe in print, or could have made a good video or visual project. But the thing is, Alexandra Township is often depicted in stereotypical ways, where the focus, is on the degradation of the environment or how unsafe it is in popular media. And I think just seeing the place really can, propel people to project assumptions about what it's like to live there. And with the microphone, Marianne was able to really point to the things that she wanted to amplify, the things that were important and relevant to her, that showed us scenes that we might have overlooked or really not paid attention to as outsiders. So she guided us and she led us to what she wanted us to see, which was important for the experience of living in Alex to be an individual one and not sort of like homogenized as sometimes happens in the popular media. So I think that is what made it powerful to use audio as opposed to any other medium. Great, thank you so much.
Thank you. That was really, really great. Shout out to Lesedi. Follow her, and just you can find her in the credits to I Will Not Grow Old Here, and I'm happy to give out the name later on. So I thought that there were a lot of really interesting points in there, especially when it comes to like the types of stories that we tell and the type of access that we get. And yes, the buzzword intimate and personal and a change in perspective, I think, make a big difference. Josephine, you told me, we shared a bus drive here to Perugia. You told me you asked a bunch of podcast creators around your area and your network. What was exactly the question that you asked them?
I asked audio journalists who have been producing and listening to multimedia projects across Africa why audio journalism is so important to them now and why they need to continue making these stories wherever they are, whether they're still in the audio space or beyond. So if you could go to the next slide.
Hi, my name is Lesedi Mokwache, and
No, it's all right.
Hold on.
So in talking to all these different audio journalists, people who curate media, who work and produce all this content, you might wonder, why is Africa Podfest, a company that sounds like it's a podcast festival, dealing with different people who maybe might be in journalism, but also maybe I've read a couple of their bylines. So we started off as a podcast festival, but we quickly learned that the best opportunity we had was to create a platform to put African podcast stories on the map. And we've been driven by this really persistent notion that whoever gets heard across Africa is decided still by a very small number of people, and that has to change. And so when I asked the folks that you see on the screen, why was this so important? And they gave their different quotes, and so you'll see a little QR code on the screen where you can read much more of their extended quote. But what I want to highlight about what you've just heard on I Will Not Grow Old Here and what they said is that, for them, audio journalism in Africa isn't just something that you do as part of your job. It's consequential that, the stories that they're telling, whether they make them to the end or they're just involved in a small part of it, they bear serious consequences, particularly now where people who are investigative journalists have to move countries, they have to hide, they have to go and record audio in a different country. They can't live the way they want to with their family and friends in many contexts. They've really benefited from a couple of things. One, working as a collaborative practice with other journalists, leaning on each other's strengths, whoever has some resources that can be shared. There's also a strong sense that there are certain stories that just won't be told unless they lean into this context. And another producer who worked on I Will Not Grow Old Here spoke about, where the next direction of podcasts like these are going.
Mm-hmm. And that's Dashan, by the way, who you see here in the black and white picture.
Yeah, so Dashan was talking about the next episode, and he said, it's an episode about a guy called Ras That Guy, and he wanted to tell them a story, but as a transgender man in Zimbabwe, he also wanted to be safe. So he says in this story, he doesn't share his real name with us. He makes up the names of people in his life. He flies to South Africa to record his narration, but none of that has any impact on how he delivers an honest and moving account of his experiences. His voice is compelling, emotional, and inspiring. In too many parts of Africa, LGBT plus youth have to overcome legal challenges, discrimination, and stigmatization. But at Radio Workshop, they're opening up a safe space for people from all backgrounds to tell stories that matter. And all of that is made possible by audio journalism. Mm-hmm. I was really moved as well by those who've been working in the investigative space. And there's a podcast that's pretty well known across East Africa, which is called Case Number Zero. And in this particular story, many of you who are working in the journalism space will be interested to know that when a journalist disappears in Africa, not all the time is there enough resources, or does a media house actually put that story on a platform. So Case Number Zero, where I think James is here, maybe? Yeah. So yesterday we had a panel about this, and he was on that panel. But this particular podcast talks about this man, Bogonko Bosire, who disappeared at a time when, it wasn't the first time he had been missing in action, in quotes, and his family and friends didn't think much of it, so they assumed he was pursuing a story. However, they were anxious when he didn't turn up for days after Kenya was engulfed in one of our most shocking terrorist attacks, the Westgate Mall terror attack. Anxious because it's the kind of story that he would be breaking. The friends and family, are completely desperate, have no answers. And so the producers spent a long time following what happened between 2015 and 2020. Telling audio stories is very expensive, so you can imagine being able to kind of revisit the story and go back to it was at a serious cost to the producers as well. And so speaking to everybody and trying to piece these clues together is really where there's a compelling reason for those of you who are in the position to support journalists working across Africa on these kinds of hard access stories. That's really why you should stay involved and amplify these stories when you get across them.
Yeah. Thanks, Josephine. And you just mentioned two big topics. Like one is LGBTQI+ as a general issue, and the criminalization and tabooization and all of that's happening across the continent. Yes, and the safety of anonymity. Anonymity. I can say that word. Which brings me to Ramsey, because Ramsey's company has. Basically, the big break was when you all published your podcast, Aib, which basically means, taboo, right? Which is a podcast where, do you want to tell people what it's about?
Yeah, sure. So my name is Ramsey. I live in Jordan. I'm really happy to be here. Thank you to the festival. They're amazing. They're so well organized. And it's nice to see everybody here. We have a podcast. So when we were thinking about what to do, some people were thinking about prison. Some people were thinking about other ideas. We were thinking, what could we do that would get a lot of attention really quickly, but still be meaningful and still kind of push the conversation forward and be really important to do as audio? And so, of course, what do? You talk about sex, right? And so we created a show that is called Aib. And Aib in Arabic means shameful or taboo. And a lot of the issues we spoke about were gender and sexuality. And so these were two things that, as you can imagine, even for someone who is a seasoned journalist or a person that shows up on TV quite a bit, it's a difficult thing to talk about publicly. If you change that setting, you take away the cameras, you lower the lights, you go into a smaller studio that is softer because of the sound, all of a sudden it's a lot easier to open up and talk about things that are really difficult to talk about normally. So that was, as Jasmin said, was kind of one of our first shows and still our biggest show. And the idea really is to provide a space to have an honest and critical conversation. And so the way we do that is through SOLT, and SOLT is a network and production company that is based in the region, and we produce mostly in Arabic. And the idea really is to look at, it's kind of a grid system, right? So you have different ideas here, you have ideas here, and at some point they meet and you think that's a really good idea, right? And so we looked at audio. Audio is specifically, we don't do anything else, right? And then we looked at topics and geographies, and we kind of grid system that out and found opportunities where it could be interesting. One opportunity that we identified was comedy in Egypt. Very funny. It works really well on audio. It was really fun. But another, hard access, something that is difficult to tell in other formats, were stories from Syria or other places where it's difficult to get in, it's difficult to get out. And another point that a lot of us have said, prison radio, stories from Africa, is you don't want someone from the outside necessarily coming in and telling that story. You want the honest voice. You want the people kind of telling their own stories. And this is something that we've found has worked really well in audio. Some people have said the authentic voice, the right voice, tone, the language. I think something in our region of the world, the language is really important. It's not just that it needs to be in Arabic, but what colloquial Arabic, what kind of Arabic, what words are people using? Maybe it was difficult to understand some of the prison radio. That's good. It's not for us, it's for them, right? They should be using their own language to talk to each other. And that's the same thing in Arabic that we find that's really important. And so, we've also tried to experiment a little bit and play. And so we have a political show that is about it's called, it used to be called Religion and the State. And often, and maybe that's not quite fair and it shouldn't be represented in this way, but it's often represented as a spectrum. You have left, you have right. It's funny enough that these two things line up with audio as well. You have a left channel and a right channel. And so we played around with some of the formats and some of the ideas where we placed left voices in the left channel and right voices in the right channel. And the idea was to bring them together. And so at some point, they're stereo, or hopefully they're at least talking to each other. Just one last thing, and then I'll turn it back over, is I just want to do a survey really quick and ask a couple of really quick questions. How many people listen to podcasts every day? Just raise your hand. Wow. How many people listen to 3 or more podcasts at least weekly? So you're listening to a lot of different podcasts. That's fantastic. And then how many, I assume most people are listening on their mobile. How many people are using Apple Podcasts? Raise your hand. Spotify? What else is there? Other things.
Google Podcasts.
Google, I think, is almost gone. There's other things as well. So you can see it's really interesting how people are listening. One thing that we're trying to do a lot is look at how people are listening, where people are listening, and when people are listening. So some people are in the morning, some people are throughout the day, in the evening. In the Arab world, it's 10 p.m. and after. People listen to a lot in the evening, later at night. One small anecdote, before Corona, we saw, the early morning people turned on, they want to listen to something as they're getting ready, and then it kind of quieted down during the day, and then again at home or on their way home. During Corona, that flattened out. People's schedules changed, they started listening in different ways, in different times, in different places. Maybe some of the commutes ended, thankfully, and so people started to listen in different ways. And so, yeah, we're interested in that and seeing how that looks.
Thanks for your data. All right, thank you, Ramsey, that was really good. So you already mentioned how the war zones, Syria, getting stories out of Syria was one of the hardest things. Same case for Yemen. So back in the day when I was with Al Jazeera still, created this podcast episode, we couldn't travel to Yemen. Yemen was a huge war zone. So I ended up working with Save the Children, and they put me in touch with 2 of their people who work with them who were in Sana'a at the time, just trying to survive. And I was trying to find a different angle to war reporting. How can we tell a human story and make people care again, because everybody was so sick and tired and numbed from the pictures of bombings and starving children. So I had them send me voice notes, which is a huge opportunity in podcasting. There's some things that could go wrong, but I just want to play this one tiny bit.
Boy, let's go. No, I'm chasing Ilyas in the dark, in the staircase. I'm actually having my phone as a torch. Mommy! What are you doing?
You're listening to someone living through a war.
Mommy, bye-bye tomorrow. For the 5th time, I'm promising him over and over, especially this week, that I'll take him out. Mommy, tomorrow we'll go out.
This is 27-year-old Sukaina. She lives in Yemen's capital, Sana'a, and right now, she is trying real hard to keep her 2-year-old boy entertained. All right, so there's like a huge opportunity there if you can give people the freedom to share their lives, something that we can all relate to from these places that we don't really relate to. We just think they're really far away. So I wanted to mention that. But on the other side, I'm working on a different podcast right now about so-called radical climate activists. And we're working with voice messages too, and we're working with a very secretive community. They're being criminalized, so whatever they have planned is basically criminal action. So whatever they share with us, we don't know if it's true or not. So there's a limitation to anonymity. This is such a tough word. Anonymity when it comes to like being able to verify whatever they tell us. And I think that is that is, I guess, all there is to this panel, I think, unless you have any other questions.
We have a few minutes.
Yes, we do.
Questions?
If there are questions. Oh, hands going up.
Oh, wow.
I saw that one first. Hi.
I'm not a broadcaster, so I need a microphone to project. Thank you so much for a great panel. I want to ask about the challenges of distribution. Sorry, this is probably more of a question for Josephine and Ramsey. Just in terms of reaching the audiences, perhaps township audiences, or the audiences that most need to hear these hard-to-access stories.
So, when you're talking about distribution, we started out in 2020 talking to people who were starting to create podcasts. And we met an amazing podcast team that was creating a podcast out of a low-income community in Kenya. And we asked them where they were recording. They said, great, there's a community radio station we're going to record. And then we said, where are you going to distribute it? And they said, Facebook, of course. Like, we're going to do a live show and it's going to be our podcast, and maybe people who are outside of the community can get it next, on other podcast platforms. But we know that our audience relies on Facebook Lite, and so they're most likely to get this messaging if we first post on Facebook using a live and then record, from the studio and then distribute later. And we asked them, what's this later? They said, maybe somebody will come back to this show, but our people will not necessarily have the data or be able to afford coming back repeatedly to come back to the same topic. There's no time, and it actually is quite expensive to keep buying data to watch these shows. And so without kind of picking through where it is that people are accessing their, shows or information about the community. This was a community podcast, so it was about health issues that were happening. It was about how to afford your next meal, who might be having a way to help the children who are at home because of the pandemic. So those kinds of topical issues. When it comes to distribution, WhatsApp shows are really popular, particularly fighting misinformation. Creating communities, because you can kind of bring people together really quickly. And also, you're not going to have lots of people access a podcast platform. They may have a radio platform on their Android device, and if you're lucky, that show is going to be able to cross over from podcast to radio, but that's if you're really lucky, because like you had some of the topics that they're discussing may not necessarily get to the top of the list when programming is happening, and a lot of these shows don't have the threshold of episodes. They don't have 50 episodes yet that perhaps would allow them to negotiate with a broadcaster to bring their show to an online platform, or to bring their show to a traditional media platform with wide reach. The other way is, through, just sending USB sticks from one place to another. You record a community meeting in one area, and your idea is to create connection, but the only way to do it is to put it on a public transport vehicle, that USB, give it to someone, and have someone at the other end collect it, because the data network doesn't have enough coverage, and you still need, these really timely reports to go from place to place. So those are some of the examples that distribution does work, and we've seen it really not take away needed resources where, they could use that for, inviting guests or making sure that they can record in that particular studio.
Just really quickly, I think there's some other ideas. We've also worked with radio. I think radio is a great way. I forgot to ask if people watch on YouTube, right? YouTube is one of the largest, if not the largest place people are consuming content. So there's a lot of different ways, but all podcasts struggle with building new audiences. Working with the platforms is probably one of the best ways. We do one more question, and then I think they're going to kick us out.
Phil, how do you manage relationships with authorities and governments, especially when they change hands? And when you look at your organization, how have you managed those relationships beyond you and the rest of your team, so they're also able to approach governments, the inmates, and all of that? And then, Josephine, how do you manage when situations where you probably have to do a retake? With the case of Marianne, if there was something you didn't think was told right, how do you manage, those security challenging situations to still get what you want?
Thank you for the question. How do I manage relationships with government, particularly when they change? With great care and diplomacy, and and it's all about building trust. So right from the beginning, we had to be really, really careful, because what people that run prisons know about is how to keep people locked up. And the idea of a radio station in a prison at the beginning was incredibly frightening for them. They were concerned about, if we broadcast live and somebody puts the fader up and starts a riot, what's going to happen? So we just started slowly and carefully, and we built the trust. And every broadcaster has a set of editorial guidelines through which they work. At the beginning, we weren't working with any editorial guidelines, because the authorities with whom we were working didn't know what editorial guidelines were. We have a license from the broadcasting regulator in the UK, so we have to abide by the Ofcom code, the Office for Communication Code. But we drafted a set of editorial guidelines, loosely based on the BBC's editorial guidelines, but shortened and adapted for a prison environment. And we gave them to the prison service and said, please can you look at these, please can you adapt them, and then please can you own them? And if we agree them, we'll work to those editorial standards. So that's how we develop the trust. When governments change, it's tricky, because it's not just governments change, it's Secretary of States for Justice that change. And just this morning, I've had the news that the Secretary of State for Justice and the Deputy Prime Minister in the UK, Dominic Raab, has finally resigned for bullying. So when I find out who the new Secretary of State for Justice is, I'll be making an appointment to see them, to talk to them about what we do. And I've forgotten what the second half of your question. My senior management team attend regular meetings with senior civil servants who run the prison service. So my senior management team have an ongoing regular relationship, sort of operational relationship. In terms of my producers, they're on the ground in prisons, and so they have a relationship with the prison governor, the boss of the prison, and prison staff, and that's their day-to-day relationship.
Thank you. Thank you all. If you see any of us walking around, you still have questions, please come talk to us. We're always happy to have a drink or a coffee. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Jasmin.